Space is a silent chaos, whose cold stars only mask the true nature of this abyss. We try to give it meanings, attributing order and logic convenient to our perception, but the truth about the universe is only partially revealed to our mind. Beyond the bright luminaries and outlined orbits, boundless and merciless expanses hide, where the law of attraction loses its force and matter is distorted into hypothetical forms, behind which lies the unknown. Looking back at the universe, we see only a faint reflection, just a tiny fragment of reality. Everything else is black holes of emptiness, hiding monstrous forces inside themselves. We are not used to thinking of space as a place where death is not the worst thing that can happen. Fragmentary hypotheses of astrophysicists suggest that in the dark corners of interstellar voids, there are phenomena to which it is impossible to apply the earthly concepts of time, space, and life. Fragments of an alien reality, according to one assumption, are able to interact with our measurements at the quantum level, influence biological structures and thinking. But in what way? What if the very act of observing space is not just a process, but a form of contact? What if peering into the darkness opens a portal not for us, but for what lives there, on the other side? People have been exploring space for centuries, trying to establish contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, looking for life signals that could confirm our hypothesis about the multiplicity of inhabited worlds. We expected to find another form of intelligence, as beautiful and intelligent as our own. But the cosmos responds only with gloomy silence and indifference. And in this silence, perhaps, the answer is hidden. Not all signals come from peaceful planets, and not all forms of life should be perceived as safe. An ominous hypothesis is increasingly emerging among space explorers, terrifying even the most daring theorists. What if the signals we intercept are not just forms of communication, but targeted instructions? What if the circuits that we accept and try to decipher are fragments of programs whose algorithms are able to change the structure of matter and mind? These thoughts are not paranoia, but an echo of facts that are carefully hidden under the secrecy. What if the cosmos, instead of striving for communication, only observes and sends us instructions for self-destruction?
Wojtowicz's office was the same as all the others in this grey building, low ceiling, simple curtains, and a table littered with folders with secret notes. The smell of paper and tobacco smoke permeated the entire space, creating a suffocating atmosphere. John was standing at the table, looking at the latest report that had arrived from the foreign intelligence base. Lips pursed, eyes heavy. He glanced sideways at Steve Summers, who was sitting across from him waiting for Wojtowicz to speak. "You have to read this," Wojtowicz, without looking up, threw a thin folder on the table which was marked "strictly secret." So they've been sitting for years listening to this nonsense, and suddenly they deciphered it on you. I didn't believe it myself at first. Steve silently took the folder, opened it, and began to read. The deep wrinkles on his forehead became even more noticeable with each line. The report looked strange. The usual radio signals coming from space objects were a chaotic mix of frequencies. Operational Report number 451 of the 12/08/2019. The Kepler Research Group. Over the past 2 months, it has been possible to record a series of radio signals coming from the Kepler 452b direction. After numerous attempts to analyze and systematize the data, repetitive patterns similar to encoded messages were found in the signal noise. The use of a quantum analyzer made it possible to identify a structure resembling the circuit of an unknown device. According to preliminary estimates, the message contains step-by-step instructions for assembling the object, the purpose of which is currently undetermined. Summers looked up and saw Wojtowicz thoughtfully tapping his finger on the folder as if urging him to read on. He turned over several pages and came across a photograph of a diagram that looked like a blueprint for some kind of device. There were inscriptions under the image, comments from scientists. Note: circuits have an internal logic and structure that indicates highly developed technical thought. The analysis of the codes showed the presence of algorithms resembling quantum processes and verbal signals. When transmitting the signal, some employees began to show symptoms of a mental disorder, obsessive repetition of phrases related to the object. Summers turned the page and saw a short message from the head of the Foreign Intelligence Group. Recommendations: stop studying the data until further investigation. The signal presumably contains not only technical instructions, but also has a direct effect on people's behavioral reactions. It can be dangerous. I don't understand, Steve began, closing the folder. We have a repeating signal. We decoded it and got the blueprints. It sounds like a standard case, but what were they going to build? Wojtowicz gave him a piercing look and fished out a thin stack of photographs from a drawer. The pictures showed the remains of the laboratory, burnt-out instruments, charred parts, and what looked like scattered pieces of human bodies. You're right, it was a standard job until they decided they could assemble what was depicted there. We lost the whole group, 6 people. The fire destroyed the laboratory almost completely, and those who were still alive. He paused and slowly spread his hands. They began to chop themselves apart, methodically, like mechanisms. Steve cocked his head, looking at Wojtowicz in disbelief. Have they gone crazy? They were conscious. Wojtowicz took a cigar from a desk box and struck a lighter. Until the very end. The records of their actions confirm this. Do you understand what this means? That damn signal they thought was a cipher. It seemed to get into their heads. People who had been working on this for over a year suddenly started going crazy after decrypting it. First, they assembled something that looked like the device indicated in the diagram. Then they burned it, destroyed the equipment, and then themselves. The operatives who arrived at the scene saw only a mountain of mutilated bodies. And does anyone still want to continue working? Wojtowicz nodded. Yes, indeed. The order is to reassemble. We need to figure out exactly what they were trying to do. Not just something that looks like a device. We must understand the purpose. A diagram is not just a diagram. As if... He lit a cigarette and blew out a thick puff of smoke. As if it was a way to get people to do what the signal says. Steve was silent, thinking about what he had read. Are we going there? What is it? He finally asked. We have to find out exactly what happened and who sent these schemes. Wojtowicz leaned on the table. And if I'm right, if it's not just technical instructions, but a kind of command, then someone or something on the other side didn't even try to communicate. It tried to subdue. The plan was extremely simple, but absurdly cruel. Wojtowicz and Summers were sitting in the same office, this time surrounded by folders with operational plans and diagrams of the future operation. 2 table lamps burned on the table, illuminating only those areas that were required for work, leaving the rest of the room in semi-darkness. On the computer monitor hung an open diagram of the base in Alaska, now dilapidated, with marks of the places where both groups were supposed to work. So we're following the standard pattern, Wojtowicz said slowly, running his finger over the map on the screen. We have 2 teams. Our group is power and the Delta group are technical specialists. We use them in the dark. Steve, sitting across from him, frowned as he flipped through the operational documents. Do these Deltovians know where they are being sent? Wojtowicz grinned, looked down at the map again and pointed to the entry point circled in red. In general terms, yes, their official mission is to clear rubble and restore basic security systems. The entrance is through the central tunnel. Everything looks simple. I requested tunnel mining schemes, but no special equipment was carried out. They will act under our supervision, and you know what that means. If everything is calm, we will let them in there and let them work out to the fullest. But if chaos starts, they will become a shield. Summers shook his head. He understood that in this case it was the only way out. It is not known what happened to the previous group, but given the condition of the bodies and the reports they saw, the risk was enormous. It is probably impossible to do without victims. "So they're the first ones in," Summers repeated slowly, gathering his thoughts together. "We'll need to lock them inside if something goes wrong. I have already ordered automated blockers in the warehouse. They'll slam all the doors and hatches if we give the command. No one will escape." Wojtowicz nodded and, without looking up, said, "Their weapons are minimal. Delta Group, engineers, equipment repair and communication specialists. The only thing they are supposed to do is a couple of pistols per group and several tear gas canisters. Well, it's just part of a mandatory set of special equipment. We need them to feel as unprotected as possible. This will keep them in check and guide them where they need to be. Our goal is to enter, collect information, and if the signal begins to manifest itself, pull out all the useful information, even if it is one of them." Summers studied the list of team members again. Engineers, a couple of system administrators, electronics specialists. All of them are experienced. Everyone has worked for the government for at least 10 years. Many of them participated in complex operations, but none of them suspected that they could be used as consumables. "They'll climb wherever we say. We even reduced the map of the territory," added Wojtowicz, paying attention to the notes on the base plan. "Here we have closed all the passages. Let them believe that this is the only way to the central server and laboratories." "And what if Delta gets into a mess?" Steve asked, not taking his eyes off the printout where the names of each member of the second group were listed in large print. Wojtowicz gave him a quick glance and, dimming the light of the desk lamp, lowered the volume of the neat dossier onto the table. "Then we come in. Our task is to keep an eye on them and get in touch at the right moment. We'll be in the next section, fully armed. If the Deltas suddenly decide that the situation is getting out of control or they start to panic, we must eliminate them. None of them should leave the area with information about what is happening there. Understood?" Steve nodded. He had participated in similar operations more than once, but he always considered such actions to be a last resort. This time, he was not sure that the Delta Group would be able to come out alive. He scratched his chin, thinking, "But if everything is as serious with this signal as we understood, what will happen if mental disorders begin or—" He paused, choosing his words. "Are the symptoms like the previous ones?" "That's why we're acting this way." Wojtowicz squinted at the map. "We have special methods of protection, background RF blocking, fully shielded helmets, as well as sensors that will monitor any changes in brain activity. I want to know if any of them suddenly have involuntary outbursts. Look, Steve, they're just bait, and we need to monitor how this signal reacts to their behavior. If he is capable of influencing, we must see it with our own eyes. Besides," he glanced at one of the reports printed out in small print, "we have no other choice. The director demands results." Summers sighed, leaning back in his chair. Wojtowicz was right, as always. "So it's a signal. Should we leave them indoors? Turn on the equipment and watch?" "Exactly." Wojtowicz got up, went to the minibar and poured himself some cognac. He looked over the Delta Group dossier, memorizing the names. "Their task is to assemble the equipment, connect it to the server and start transmitting the signal. As soon as it starts working, we cut them off from the outside world and wait to see what happens. If they can handle it, we'll leave together. If something goes wrong," he took a sip of cognac and set the glass aside, "they will become hostages of the situation. We need to understand what's in this signal. We can't afford to go out without data." Steve stared at the map. He imagined this abandoned complex in the middle of an icy desert again. Ruined corridors, burnt walls, the smell of burning and molten metal, and then the moans of those who died without even realizing what drove them crazy. "The operation will begin in 2 days," Wojtowicz added sharply. "Go to the place now. Are you ready?" Steve took one last look at the documents. The Delta Group had no idea what was waiting for them. "Yes, but tell me, John." Steve squinted, as if trying to catch something in Wojtowicz's tired face. "What is our chance to get out of there in our right mind?" Wojtowicz just shrugged his shoulders. "You know the answer, Steve. Either we figure out what's going on, or we'll go crazy first." The object stood on the edge of an icy desert, shrouded in fog and cold, which seemed impenetrable. There was an endless snowy wasteland around, into which the frozen remains of rusty structures went. The base that was supposed to be explored looked like a dead beast whose huge metal ribs were sticking out of the icy hull. They arrived at the site in the late afternoon, and a thick haze quickly descended on everything around, giving the object an even more eerie appearance. There was a foul smell of burning and molten metal in the air. The old lamps at the entrance to the main building flared up, illuminating the charred walls on which there were spots that looked like traces of blood. "Damn," Steve muttered, looking around the ruined corridors. "What the hell happened here?" "Wojtowicz, look!" someone from the Delta Group shouted, approaching one of the doors. Wojtowicz and Summers went to the engineer, who was standing at the half-open airlock. Beyond it was a small laboratory compartment littered with debris and old documents. But the strangest thing was that right on the floor in the middle of the laboratory there was an incomprehensible object, a shiny metal structure resembling a complex device. The glass tubes inside flickered with a faint light, and tiny wires like vessels ran along its surface. "This is what they were trying to collect," Wojtowicz whispered, looking at the object with tension. "The circuit of the signal. They built it." Engineers from the Delta Group began to inspect the device, frozen as if hypnotized. One of them, a middle-aged man with grey hair, gently touched the structure. At the same moment, the device seemed to come to life. The light inside the tubes became brighter, and faint discharges ran along the metal surfaces. "It's working!" the engineer shouted, but immediately jumped back when a thin beam of light burst out of the device and crashed into the ceiling, leaving a charred trail. Summers tensed and grabbed for his weapon. The entire Delta Group froze, not knowing what to do next. Wojtowicz watched the engineers, trying not to miss the slightest detail. Too quickly, they went from bewilderment to genuine delight. People's faces began to contort into grimaces of obsession. "Everyone back up!" Wojtowicz barked. "Get out of the lab!" But the engineers did not obey. They huddled around the device as if mesmerized. One of them suddenly started laughing loudly, then howled like a wounded animal, clutching his head. The man tried to say something intelligible, but his voice broke into sobs. "It's talking to me." The next few seconds passed in terrible silence. Everyone froze, watching as the engineer rushed at the device and began to break it with his hands. The rest of the Delta Group rushed to him, but instead of stopping him, they began to fight with each other. One of them grabbed a screwdriver and violently plunged it into his partner's throat, pouring blood all around. "Get out of the room!" Wojtowicz shouted, signaling the others. The commandos reacted instantly, reached for their weapons, but it was too late. One of the engineers with bulging eyes rushed forward and bit into the throat of the nearest operative, tearing out meat and scattering shreds of flesh. The others attacked him with such force as if something inside them had broken, as if all the last threads of reason had been snapped in an instant. "Retreat!" Wojtowicz barked, pulling Summers back. The commandos rushed to the exit, leaving the Delta Group to deal with itself. The carnage inside the laboratory continued. The sounds of blows, screams, and crunching bones covered everything around. Suddenly, one of the engineers jumped up, holding something like an iron rod in his hands, and brought it down with superhuman force on the metal device. The flash blinded everyone, and the laboratory was flooded with bright blue light. Wojtowicz realized that it was time to act. He pulled out the remote control and punched in the lock code. All the doors in the complex began to slowly close. "Are they under control?" Summers gasped, retreating to the wall. "So far, yes," Wojtowicz replied, but his voice was trembling. "We're closing all the floodgates. Launch the Zone 13 protocol." Summers darted to the control panel and activated the program. Within seconds, all the entrances and exits of the complex were sealed, as if a huge steel trap had slammed shut on the engineers. "My God, what was that?" one of the Special Forces operatives croaked, standing at the entrance to Block B. "Are they crazy?" "Damn signal," Wojtowicz said, looking back at the lab. He did the same thing to them that he did to the scientists before. "I thought we'd have more time." Suddenly, the voice of the commander of the Special Forces group was heard on the radio. Wojtowicz, we have a problem. There was panic in his voice. Something's wrong with people. The psyche goes to hell. They start behaving like animals. One has already... The connection broke off in mid-sentence. What the... Summers did not have time to finish, as the next second there was a loud roar right behind the wall, and then a burst of machine guns. Panic began in the corridors. The people who had just calmly followed Wojtowicz and Summers were now breaking each other's limbs, shooting at random, trying to tear each other apart with their hands. Wojtowicz watched with fury as everything went haywire. He grabbed Summers by the shoulder. "Come on, we have to get out!" he shouted, pulling him towards the exit. But the corridors were already covered in blood. The operatives were writhing on the floor, someone was laughing hysterically, and someone was trying to chew through their wrists. Wojtowicz knew what had happened. They were all victims of the signal. No one could resist his influence. The group scattered like sand, scattered by the wind. "Requesting evacuation, immediately!" Wojtowicz yelled into the walkie-talkie. "The code is red, we're leaving! Call for a missile strike!" Seconds later, a cold, mechanical voice came on the line. "Code red is rejected. Keep watching. Evacuation is not possible." "What the..." Wojtowicz growled into the walkie-talkie. "They're all gonna die. I'm giving the order to strike. Burn this damn place down." "Request denied," the voice repeated. "The government has other plans for this facility." Wojtowicz froze, staring at the walkie-talkie as if it were a snake ready to bite his throat. "John!" Summers grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him towards the exit. "Come on, we can't wait any longer." They ran down the corridor, leaving chaos behind them. Arms and legs flashed as if in slow motion, and death moans and screams could be heard around. They jumped onto the runway and climbed into the remaining helicopter. "Take off!" Wojtowicz shouted to the pilot, but he only nodded silently, starting the engine. The rotor roared, and the car began to slowly lift off the ground. Below, the building, like a wound in a snowy desert, blazed with a bloody glow. Wojtowicz sank heavily into a chair, gritting his teeth. His hand was clutching the phone convulsively. The bones of his fingers were white. The room was deathly silent, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. He put the phone to his ear again and screamed without holding back. "What the hell are you doing? These people are dead, the best people, damn you. You..." He sighed, catching his breath, and continued. "You turned me into a damn puppet. Do you think I'm just going to swallow this?" On the other end of the line, the voice was even and calm, as if Wojtowicz was not talking to a living person, but to a soulless machine. "John," said a voice with a soft intonation, as if it were a personal psychologist. "You were following orders, nothing personal. You know what we're doing and what's at stake. You're only part of the system." Wojtowicz pursed his lips, his shoulders trembled with tension. "Part of the system," he repeated, almost hissing. "Part of the system." Suddenly, Wojtowicz slammed his fist on the table so that folders and papers flew apart. "What the hell? You promised that if the signal turns out to be dangerous, we will destroy the object. You promised that we would be able to pick up our own if something went wrong. And now..." He paused, listening to the other's unflappable silence. "Now you're sitting there in your damn offices and talking about higher goals." "John," the voice spoke softly again, without changing the key, "you better calm down. You knew there was such a possibility. War always requires sacrifices. You don't have to take it personally. It is important that we move forward, for the sake of science, for the sake of all mankind. You're not a pawn, John, but you're not a king either. You are the means." Wojtowicz froze, feeling the growing rage inside him begin to subside. This calmness only made it worse. The remedy. The word stuck in his mind like a scalpel opening an old wound. "You've lost your men," the voice was saying, "but the mission is completed. The signal has been studied. We have taken a step forward. We've lost more than people," Wojtowicz whispered softly. "We've lost control. What will happen to the object? Leave it to us. Everything is under control." The voice rose slightly to emphasize that the conversation was over. "The data and debris that you have managed to collect have already been delivered to the research center. Wait for further instructions." Wojtowicz wanted to say something, but the phone gave a sharp signal. The connection was cut off. He froze for a second, just looking at the device, and then, with an effort of will, he threw it aside and stood up. His gaze lingered on the laptop screen where a notification suddenly flashed. An incoming message. Priority 1. The words "secret channel" were flashing red. Struggling to cope with his irritation, Wojtowicz sat down at the table and opened the letter. He just stared at the long text for a few seconds and then began to read. The secret report on the object 04A Kepler. Document number X22200, OP2 Zircon Network. Tolerance level absolute. Date 09/18/2019. Status final. Object experimental development based on a signal from the planet Kepler 452b. Subject conducting experiments on an evacuated subject, Alpha Sector subproject. Description: during the liquidation of the Delta Group and the main special unit, one survivor was evacuated. See personal file X001. The subject demonstrated atypical reactions for humans. An increased pain threshold, a surge in activity in areas of the brain responsible for decision-making and short-term memory, and the absence of typical reactions to psychotropic drugs. Autopsy results from previous members of the group indicate the presence of structural changes in brain tissues similar to reticular lining. Operational conclusions. 1. The Kepler signal has a complex effect on the central nervous system and bioelectric activity. 2. The resonant frequencies of the signal synchronize with the activity of the hypothalamus and stimulate certain areas of the brain, increasing aggressive behavior and lowering the threshold of fear. 3. The use of the signal as a means of manipulating consciousness is confirmed. Control over the subject is possible with the help of special frequencies embedded in the signal. Recommendations: continue experiments on the evacuated commandos, hereinafter referred to as Subject 04. Use special resonators to test the possibility of creating a chain reaction in the neural network of the Subject 04. Object 04 is considered a valuable data source. Experiments should be conducted in complete isolation, under constant supervision. If successful, it is possible to use a signal to locally suppress the will of the population. Wojtowicz's eyes rested on the last line. The use of a signal to suppress the will. So that's what they've been trying to achieve all these years. Not communication, not contact, but a tool, a weapon. He suddenly felt as if he had been struck by a chill. They were waiting for this moment. They knew it could happen. There was another attachment in the report, a video file labeled X22200A4. Wojtowicz opened it. A dark room appeared on the screen, illuminated only by a dim red light. Behind the massive glass sat a man in a Special Forces uniform. Disheveled, dirty, but alive. His face seemed strangely blank. The eyes are wide open, unnaturally shiny, as if covered with an oily film. Object 4, stable condition, said a voiceover, switching on the resonant device. The light indicators lit up on the screen. The man behind the glass began to twitch, as if his body had become too heavy for him. After a few seconds, he slowly raised his head and smiled faintly. Starting the stimulation, the man abruptly stood up, jerked towards the glass and began hitting it with his hands and then with his head, ignoring the blood pouring into his face. Wojtowicz recoiled. He had seen these symptoms before. It was the same as with scientists and engineers. The signal subdued him, made him a puppet. Termination of the session. The voice over rang out again. The resonance is stopped. Object 04 demonstrates complete obedience to commands. Cancel the attack. The man in the glass chamber froze, his shoulders relaxed. He slowly walked back and sat down on the floor, staring at one point like a broken doll. Wojtowicz couldn't take his eyes off the screen. Everything inside seemed to shrink. He was used. And they will be used again, and they'll do it over and over again until they get what they want. Everything was decided in advance. Swallowing hard, he reached for a box of cigars, took out one, and slowly lit it. He knew what he was going to do. "Summer's come into the office," he said hoarsely into the walkie-talkie. "We still have work to do.